Oh, this is going to be a brief philosophy lecture again. Inspired by a YouTube video I saw. Just the thumbnail, rather. It's on a lecture on mathematical points or pointillisms. I like to neologism it in kind of a whimsical way, modality. So, the topic of this very brief philosophical lecture is going to be on the topic of mathematical points and mathematical objects themselves. And the question is today, where did mathematics ultimately pre-exist before it even entered the ontological or Platonic designation of existence? So, and what does this imply about, the way we quantify points on this lines or intervals and these kind of mathematically grouped ontologies? It kind of speaks to the notion of why do we often use integers to quantify eigenvalues on a line, not say, I don't know, a surreal, imaginary, a Catalan, a Carmichael, a Grothendieck, a Gödel, omniversal eigenvalue. Like it goes on and on. So today we'll just briefly open this lecture by saying, well, it's always going to be kind of an eternal, kind of perennial question of why mathematics has not only infinite depth, structure, volume, capacity, and translate in its underlying ideological content, its prime mover, its final cause, as Aristotle said. It's also a question of how omnipresent is mathematics kind of widespread in not only the faculties of judgment in the neo-Kantian sense, what it means to perceive and aggregate your mereological density of your sense datum and your qualia into kind of these empiricized categories that are truly mind independent, I suppose, and are not just fuzzy logic truth, but bivalent Boolean truth. So I think that ultimately the notion of mathematical points is, well, how do you even count a mathematical points? Like you go from the monad versus the dyad, the single pointillism to the double pointillism. And I think that ultimately this is a question of what it means to quantify the quasi-unquantifiable or the quasi-uncomputable at all. What is the most metaphysically, deontologically necessary imperative of how we're to best objectively represent eigenvalues according to objective reality when we measure points on a line, or points themselves. So what is a mathematical point? Well, you can take an ultra-finitist and you can say, well, it's an infinitesimal kind of torque, or not torque, but torus that kind of encloses its mereological boundaries. It's not an open entropic, not infinitesimal system. It's a closed circuitry system that's kind of has a membrane wall, even as an infinitesimal point. A single drop. A single drop in the ocean, I suppose, of lemniscates, infinities, and Boltzmann brains waxing their whimsical woven entrails of carbonated language and mathematical axioms. But anyhow, I just want to say that certainly the notion of what it means for mathematical points to aggregate themselves across possible worlds and how that epiphenomenally produces the structures associated with Platonism, structural formalism, postmodernism, even consciousness and Ontogony, the hard problems, is profound. And I think that a non-integer, I suppose, not just an ancient Greek Calmaniac society counterfactually, but a worldwide global society didn't even quantify points, didn't even quantify integers ever. Where would it be like in terms of egalitarianism or political ontology or, Zizekian critical theory? Like, where would it be if we simply didn't use ever integers, or we didn't simply use eigenvalues that were ever quantified in points? Now, a point, if a closed nanoscopic system indexed on a mathematical, perhaps infinite spatiality, whether horizontal or vertical, is thus a pointillism. Becomes a question of how do you order and aggregate points according to, say, Aleph, ordinal, card, set theoretical, say deontologic. Well, You can order all possible points by deontical logic simply by creating a universal deontological truth machine that requires every infinitesimal or quasi-infinitesimal point system. Which, and again, it's a donut. It's like a membrane. It's a house. It's a closed entropic system around infinite space. Even if that entropic system, that donut, as I like to put it, is itself still a point. So if these systems then exist, then it would really be kind of an absolute thermodynamic chaotic soup. There would be no rhythmatic structure. There would be no hylomorphism in the Platonic sense. The form, the Platonic, the idealism, the eternal essence that reverberates through the matterless forms as Platonic sense. So I think that's certainly. Now I'll just say one quick. This has nothing to do with mathematical points, but that I think when and where the day society breaks past its notion that artificial plastic consumerism and dumbing down your intellect and reading horoscopes and liking celebrities and not even thinking for yourself beyond a celebrity tabloid is what makes you a sophisticated woman. It's one of the biggest lies that are bought out in this consumerist society, this capitalistic society that unfortunately is all too, I suppose, psychoanalytic and not always in a way that's truly representative of love at its climax of beautiful egalitarian harmony and equinumerosity, to put it simply. So anyways, the going back to mathematical points. Now, if a mathematical point can be quantified according to the trans-world identity or rigid designator ontological status of possible world semantics, it becomes a question of what infinitesimal or even nanoscopic, not necessarily anywhere near infinitesimal, orders of magnitude less, but nonetheless a donut or a closed entropic system. What does that mean in a possible world? Is it for a system to be entropic or not entropic according to possible world semantics at all? And I argue that it really is goes back to the average many worlds interpretations maximized throughout all possible worlds, but instead applied to, nanoscale thermodynamic engineering of space-time metrics, which I suppose is pointless in my perspectivist argument. Now, closing this argument, I just want to say that while I really didn't touch on, I suppose, the whole crux of what there's probably more in-depth lectures about mathematical points, I will say that the role of open versus entropic nanoscale monads, whether in the Leibnizian sense or the non-Leibnizian sense, scattered and arrayed and moleculed like chemical compounds or chemical batteries around, Planck volume, a space-time metric, invariant slice of qualia. It all reveals this kind of substance monist reality that information is an ontological real substance, but it also behaves with kind of a metaphysical necessity in how it extracts itself and kind of evaporates in the humdrum, the kind of hallways of eternity, sempiternal metaphysical law. And whether all possible mathematical points across the Omniverse can be received by a god is, again, a profound question, and I think a neglected one. So, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will begin my conclusion by saying that we must look past integers as kind of these default modus operandi methods of not only quantifying the empiricized and metaphysical Lebensworlds, but also as a proxy of describing open versus closed systems. Like there's an ontological question of why we tend to use the integers for what reason behind human conventionalism beyond the anthropic principle at all. So, and the ever pointillism, a bit faux pas there, but I'll say is that how we classify infinitesimal or not so infinitesimal but still microscale monads and leverage them in kind of a carburetor, I suppose, nanoscopic electric conductor sense can have these kind of physical parallel reverberations where, simply dramatically reordering, say, the fish oil. Let's just use a very pragmatically rooted argument. When you take a fish oil supplement, and it clears out kind of the mental fog, I suppose, the unclarity, the reminiscent of a lower IQ level rationale and knowledge, and assuming knowledge exists. Well, it really is a question of, again, what kind of open and closed systems were accounted for in these dockets, these neuron transmitter systems at all, and whether they really can be quantified, not only in points, but mathematical eigenvalues that represent integer reality, or slice of it anyways, a perspective on it. So thank you so much for this lecture, and I hope you left with a few profound new thoughts on this topic. So bye.